And we have here today to stay with us for the next few hours, Paola Caridi, who is one of the experts on Hamas, and for sure one of the few experts in Italy on Hamas. She's the founder and president for a time of Lettera 22. She's a journalist who's been working with Limes, with Fatto Quotidiano, and with other daily and weekly newspapers, where she has always been correspondence from Cairo and Jerusalem. So she's an expert of the Middle East, an expert of the Swana regions that has been contributing also important knowledge on the complex politics in these areas. She has been authors of many important books, from the work on Hamas, which was published in 2009, but in a new editions in 2023, to work mainly published by Feltrinelli on Jerusalem. And the two most recent books that I just want to recall is Il Gelso di Gerusalemme, another story recounted through trees, and most recent also in 2025, Sudari, Elegia for Gaza. In fact, what I think it is important to mention, also because many of the students in these summer schools are very interested in what we can do, is that Paola has been a pivotal activist in the movement L'ultimo giorno di Gaza, which I think has had an important role played in triggering also the intersectional resistance to the genocide that Francesca was talking about before, because it has been important in convincing people that they could do something, and that they could do something using their everyday life, that they could participate. And I think that many of those who were present on the September 22 strikes, who went for the first time to protest, also under quite challenging conditions, were also mobilized through the initiatives of L'ultimo giorno di Gaza. So she's now talking about Hamas, but then in the discussions also we can go into the most recent type of development. It is important to talk about Hamas because it has been one of the most censored topic after October 7th, with also among journalists in the media guidelines in Germany, for instance, saying Hamas must be named only as terrorist organizations. Of course, it has also used terrorism, but it is a much more complex type of organizations, and it is important to understand what is happening in Gaza and in Palestine, not only as humanitarian issues, but also as a political issues. We had a few months ago an initiative by another of our Palestinian colleagues, Gadir, who has organized an encounters of scholars from Gaza, pointing at the importance also of reflecting on the political, the social, the economic issues related with the Palestine. So Paola, I'm extremely pleased to be introducing you now, and I just wanted to mention that we had also another speaker, Anna Foa, an historian and intellectual who had investigated and written on the persecutions of the Jews in Europe, and a recent book that we wanted to discuss with her about the ways in which Israel was killing itself. It's called in Italian Il suicidio di Israele. Unfortunately, Anna, for family reasons, could not come today. We have more time to discuss with Paola, but also, of course, we can address the issues not only of Hamas and Gaza, but also of the ways in which these situations transformed the image of Israel among us. Paola, please.
Thank you, Donatella. Thank you all. Thank you, Mario. Thank you for inviting me in the summer school. I think it's important to speak about the elephant in the room here because we speak a lot about, we name Hamas, but we don't speak about Hamas. And I started more than 20 years ago, yes, more than 20 years ago, to research on Hamas during my stay in Jerusalem, where I lived for 10 years after Cairo. And I think it's important to underline that I came to Jerusalem from Cairo, not from Rome, so from a different, extremely different perspective. And I was there, I was in Jerusalem, and there were the elections, the political elections in the occupied Palestinian territory. I was actually in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank on that wonderful day when people went to the polls and voted thinking about democracy and thinking to exercise democracy in that case. And we didn't understand at that time how important was the consensus around Hamas, not only for protesting against the PA and the corrupt clique around, the leadership, not only Mahmoud Abbas, but also for the proposal. I mean, for what Hamas proposed to the people, to the electorate through the change and reform list. And it was astonishing, it was surprising. And it meant also that we understood that Hamas was not only in Gaza. Hamas was everywhere among the Palestinian society well before the 1987 founding of Hamas in Gaza City. And it was because of the refugees question, for sure. It was because the Muslim Brotherhood that was widespread in the Palestinian territory, in Palestine before 1948. But what I experienced, I'm one of the Dirty Dozen, the international Dirty Dozen who studied Hamas, who continue to study Hamas. And we continue to study, although it's very different to research now when I compare my research with the time of the participatory twist of Hamas in 2005, 2008, let's say. In that period, there was a window of opportunity, and we had this gift to research a movement that wanted to show themselves, give their version, express their history and narrate their history, while in the last, let's say, 15 years, the picture is very foggy, it's foggier than before. So now it's very difficult to understand the internal dynamics and where Hamas is going. And Gaza became central once again, as it was in 1987, let's say, in 1995, 87, 80, 89. And it is because the territory is now sealed, and it used to be sealed as it was sealed from 2007 until 2023. I'm not saying that Gaza was not experiencing a closure, a strict closure and embargo before 2007, when the Ezzedine al-Qassam brigades did the coup in Gaza against Fatah. But after the coup, after 2007, the sealing of the territory was so complete that it gave to Hamas a territoriality in Gaza that it didn't have before. So, however, as paradoxical as it may seem, it is especially during the period of the highest pressure and closure that the Gaza constituency not only gained the predominant territorial power in the Gaza Strip, but also shaped its specific weight into Hamas' overall leadership. I don't know if you know, but there are 4 constituencies inside the Hamas organizational structure: Gaza, the West Bank, abroad means the refugee camps outside Palestine, and a very particular constituency that is prison. That means the Israeli prisons and the activists inside the prisons who continued to exercise politics. We don't know after October 7 if they are allowed, I think not, if they are allowed to exercise politics. But the 4 constituencies, were very important until 2007, and after 2007 something happened. So, closed by the Israeli siege and embargo, Hamas managed to build a dominant political, administrative, and military power over the Strip that increased its overall role even before the rise of Yahya Sinwar. The liberation of Yahya Sinwar in 2011, however, marked a shift, strengthened the internal political balance, the Ezzedine al-Qassam brigades, which in recent years has transformed from an armed wing to a military wing, and in fact, this is what I think, became the 5th shadow constituency. So after the 4 constituencies, let's say territorial constituencies, I think there is now a shadow constituency, the Ezzedine al-Qassam brigades. And it started from 2006, 2007. The elements all revolve around the participatory twist decided by Hamas in 2005 through a widespread consultation of its base and adherents. The change in strategy and partially also in goals is evident in the Cairo agreement signed in March 2005 by all the Palestinian factions, and in the decision taken by Hamas to participate in the electoral process, actually to suspend the suicide attacks and to participate in the electoral process within the territory over which the Palestinian Authority exercised, at least formally, its power. And it's very important to underline that participating to the elections for the PLC, for the Palestinian parliament, the PA parliament, meant for Hamas to recognize in a very ambiguous way the two states. And if not the two states, the state of Palestine on the Palestinian occupied territory. The cornerstones or the redefinition of Hamas strategy are based essentially on the participation in a reformed PLO. It didn't happen. It was unsuccessful until now. And in the PA institutions, despite the fact that the Islamist movement had always opposed the Oslo paradigm. If not a caesura in the history of Hamas, certainly it can be referred to as a twisting of positions in a phase of profound transition in Palestinian politics, subsequent to the Second Intifada, and subsequent to Israel's violent extrajudicial decimation of the Hamas leadership. Within 1.5 years, between 2002 and 2004, Israel carried out extrajudicial targeted killings of, among others, Salah Shehadeh, that means the founder of the Al-Qassam brigades, Ismail Abu Shanab, a moderate pragmatist, negotiator. It's not the first time that Israel killed negotiators. Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the founder, the number 2, Abdelaziz Arantisi. And in the same time, in 2004, the death of Yasser Arafat. It is a torsion that is combined with an acceleration of events. Hamas electoral success in 2006, but also in the municipal elections in 2005. Those two elements unleashed the real earth tremors that affected not only the overall Palestinian political picture, but also the internal balances within the Hamas structure. It is particularly the relationship between the political wing, multi-layered, and the armed wing that went through a stress test in 2006, 2007. So it's almost 20 years of stress tests. Until then, the relationship between the two wings remained within a precise setting. The political wing held the decision-making leverage, while the Ezzedine al-Qassam brigades maintained their room for maneuver regarding the tools to be used. To be more specific, the military wing, or the armed wing at that time, was independent from its political counterpart from an operational point of view. It happened also on October 7. This decision had been taken after the arrests at the end of the 80s that had decimated the movement, not least of all due to the information about military activities given to the Israelis by collaborators. The independence of the movement's two wings had therefore been considered vital to avoid the possibility that Israel might attempt to track down and destroy the entire organization. An important point of discontinuity is represented by a very specific event because of the act itself, and especially because of the timing. It is the attack against the Israeli base at Kerem Shalom, just across the Gaza border. You know Kerem Shalom now because of what is happening during the last 2 years, and sometimes because some Palestinians had the opportunity to go out through the Kerem Shalom crossing. The attack was carried out in June 2006 by the Qassam Brigade. In June 2006, it means that Hamas had won the elections just 6 months earlier. Ismail Haniyeh was the first Palestinian prime minister from an Islamist background. And in that moment, after 6 months, the Qassam brigades attacked the Kerem Shalom military base. 2 Israeli soldiers were killed, and one, Gilad Shalit, was kidnapped and taken inside the Gaza Strip, where he would remain 5 years until his release in exchange for the release of 1,027 Palestinian prisoners, not all from Hamas, but from all the Palestinian factions, and among them, the first in the list, Yahya Sinwar. We know the story also because one of the protagonists, Marwan Issa, explained its political dimension. And Marwan Issa is a very important protagonist, not only of the Gilad Shalit kidnapping, of the attack at Kerem Shalom, but also one of the protagonists of October 7, because we know through the voice of another political protagonist, Sayed Abu Musame. He released an interview a few days ago, mid-September, explaining October 7 from his eyes as one of the founders of Hamas. And he named the names, and the names were the names we knew: Yahya Sinwar, Marwan Issa, the number 2 of the Qassam brigades, and Mohammed Deif, the head of the Qassam brigades. Yahya Sinwar, as far as I understand, was not from and not only an operative point of view, but from, his role, part of the Qassam brigades. His brother, yes, and his brother was extremely important to push for the release of Yahya Sinwar, because he was the man who did the negotiations from the inside and took Gilad Shalit for 5 years inside the Gaza Strip. But Marwan Issa wanted to tell the story of the Gilad Shalit kidnapping and negotiation and so on and so forth, and especially the reason why they decided to attack the Kerem Shalom military base. He was later assassinated by the Israeli forces during the genocide. In probably his first ever interview, of course, he was covered in the dark. Granted in July 2021 to Al Jazeera Arabic investigative journalist Tamer al-Mishal, he gave an analytical report of the Shalit abduction and the 5-year-long negotiation for the prisoners' exchange finalized on October 18, 2011. The wording used by Marwan Issa to describe the reason behind Shalit abduction sheds a different light on the events unfolding during the spring and summer of 2006, while Hamas political wing tried and failed to arrange a unity government with Fatah after its electoral success. Marwan Issa affirmed that the military wing made the decision. In other words, Shalit's abduction changed some of the crucial rules inside Hamas, and the prisoners' exchange profoundly modified the balance of power inside the Islamist movement. So here there are the Marwan Issa words. Was difficult to decide this operation under the prevailing political situation when Hamas joined the government and got involved in political action. The military wing felt the pressure. It was clear that the enemy, under those political circumstances, was imposing pressure on the ground and tightening the grip on Palestinian resistance targets. That's why we took a firm decision to retaliate and conduct the operation, no matter how high the price. And it's important to underline this. this sentence because in a way is an answer to your question, no matter how high the price. My assumption is that the military wing's decision to proceed with the Kerem Shalom attack had taken, therefore, on a political role that jeopardized the very structure of the Palestinian Islamist movement. It was the first decision of this kind, followed by the 2007 coup in Gaza, when Hamas military wing, both the Izzadin al-Qassam brigades and the executive force linked to the Said Siam Ministry of Interior, had in fact misled the political wing and had decided to force its hand to the most extreme consequences out of fear that time would favor Fatah. Fatah reorganized its armed wing in Gaza, thanks to the support of the Western powers, and the Al-Qassam brigades decided to act before the Force 17, the Fatah armed group. Between 2006 and 2007, the armed groups linked to the two main political factions became the real protagonists of the confrontation, both as instruments of political conflict and as groups who exerted pressure on their own leadership. And the friction reached all the way into the security institutions, which in spring 2006 were still in the process of being reformed. In April 2006, Abbas reinforced the Presidential Guard and made it answerable directly to him, and established an organization tasked with monitoring the borders, which in practice meant the crossings between Gaza and Egypt at Rafah. Hamas responded by establishing the Security Forces Unit, a body that took its orders from the Haniyeh government's Interior Ministry, thereby challenging Abu Mazen authority. The executive force brought together the groups that had been established and consolidated during the Second Intifada, and it did in Gaza. Thus, it was not just Hamas militants who joined the executive force, but more importantly, the members of the Popular Resistance Committee, PRC, as well. The PRC was itself heterogeneous and not integrated into the Islamist movement. In a move that appeared to be aimed at strengthening link with the PRC, Siam appointed as Director General of his ministry, the Minister of Interior, the founder of the PRC, Jamal Abu Samadana, who was also second on Israel's most wanted list. Abu Samadana's appointment, therefore, was yet another spark of a very dry fire, and one that could not but seriously embarrass Abbas, who sure enough immediately, yet unsuccessfully, attempted to block it. The executive force initially comprised 3,000 men, but practically doubled within a few months, and the perception was that the force had been established for two reasons: to reinforce and regularize the military tools at Hamas' disposal in the Gaza Strip, and to establish an organization strong enough to confront the preventive security force, which has traditionally been close to Mohammed Dahlan. That means at that time, one of the supporters of Mahmoud Abbas, and after that is his strongest enemy. That was the situation in May 2006. So a very difficult situation for the role of the armed wings. But in a surprise move, however, this cycle of violence was broken on May 11, 2006, by the prisoners held in Israeli jails, the only group within the Palestinian society whose moral standing was high enough to bring both Hamas and Fatah together at the negotiating table, And this is the reason the prison constituencies for all the factions are so important. This is the reason why the cursus honorum of Yahya Sinwar describe his role after his liberation in 2011 and the very quick career he did inside Gaza, because he was the head of Hamas prison constituency. And this is extremely important for the fabric, for the Palestinian society fabric. I was allowed by the Israeli authorities to go inside an Israeli jail, and of course it was a 5-star Israeli jail, not the Ketziot camp, but the Beersheba jail. I was one of the few journalists who had this opportunity. I asked to interview not the people who participated to the organization of the suicide attacks, but I asked to meet the activists. And of course, after receiving the permit, being for many hours in a jail, in a cell in the Beersheba jail, I went to the prisoner society to understand who I met, because I didn't know before. So I had to be sure that there were not collaborators among the people I've met in a cell for, I think, 4 hours. And I was lucky enough because they showed me the prisoner's document, the draft of the prisoner's document in 2005. It's the same document that in 2006 was the last way to not to block the separation, the fracture, between Fatah and Hamas. If in mid-2006 a national dialogue was restarted, it was because of that document drawn up by the prisoners and signed by the most important leaders of each movement, emerged from the Hadarim penitentiary in central Israel. The so-called prisoner document contained a few novelties compared to what had been said a few weeks earlier by Hamas leaders in the West Bank and Gaza, who had attempted to reconcile ambiguity and inflexibility with statements that differed merely in their tone. The document was blunt. Palestine is the land within the 1967 borders, including the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. Refugees have the right of return. Hamas and Islamic Jihad must become PLO members. Internal Palestinian divisions and armed confrontation between factions must cease. And there must be a relationship of reciprocal respect and trust between the PA presidency, Abbas, and the Prime Minister's office, Haniyeh. Thus, the document attempted to bring together essentially internal matters, such as the clash between factions, with the need to break the PA's increasing isolation. But then arrived the coup in 2007, and Gaza became abruptly the only territorial constituency in which the Islamist movement also meant the power, the authority, the government, and the military forces. So the prisoners' document didn't reach the point and didn't break not only the isolation, but the fracture between the factions. It is only a few years later that the political presence of the military wing had its confirmation in the result of Hamas internal elections in April 2012 for the renewal of the Gaza Politburo. To the detriment of the defeated pragmatists, the newly elected list is significant. It is the newly elected list in the Hamas Gaza constituency that is extremely important, or at least it was extremely important until October 2020, 2023. Ahmed Jabari and Marwan Issa, first of all. That means two of the most important protagonists of the Al-Qassam brigades. And then Khalil al-Haya. And you know that now Khalil al-Haya is the chief negotiator, but we don't know so much about his health conditions. And Nizar Awadallah, whose elections is said to have been taken place with the votes controlled by the Al-Qassam brigades. However, the most critical name coming out of the Politburo elections of the Gaza constituency is Yahya Sinwar. He was the one who would change the balance of the movement in the following years with his entry into the Politburo. Yahya Sinwar had been one of the founders in the early years of Al-Majid, the squad constituted by Sheikh Ahmad Yassin to identify and punish collaborators with Israel. Arrested in 1988, condemned to a life sentence, he led the prison constituency as the most prominent Hamas figure in the Israeli jails. His name had been among the heaviest for Israel in the Gilad Shalit exchange list, and his return to Gaza in 2011 significantly changed the internal balance of power. Above all, his presence added an important part to the increasingly strong weight of the Gaza constituency within the leadership, the overall leadership. Internally, the Gaza constituency had established its strength through territoriality, but it was once again isolated and therefore a target. After abandoning the safe haven of Damascus in 2012, the leadership abroad was dispersed to countries that have given hospitality to different leaders. For years, the West Bank activists continued to suffer the Israeli and the PA security forces' repression. Isolated and weakened, Hamas changed the internal balance of its leadership in favor of an impressive, stronger role of the Gaza constituency. The change at the top witnessed the passing of the baton from Khaled Meshal, the leading figure in the abroad constituency, to Ismail Haniyeh, since years the main figure of the Gaza constituency. Khaled Meshal's long history at the helm of the Hamas Politburo ended in 2017, 5 days after the release of the new de facto charter, not the jure, but de facto charter, the document of the principles publicly exposed in Doha, Sheraton Hotel. After more than 20 years since he took Musa Abu Marzouk's place on an emergency basis in 1996, Meshal left the post in the hands of Ismail Haniyeh on May 6, 2017. A few years younger, Haniyeh shared the same path as Meshal within Hamas since the movement's origins. It was the man more close to Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. It was his assistant. There was, however, a substantial difference. Meshal's life was marked by exile for all his life, his whole political path being within the abroad constituency. On the other hand, Haniyeh's life, personal as well as political, was entirely inside the Gaza Strip, more specifically inside the Shati camp. There is not anymore a Shati camp until nowadays, for the genocide. He was within the dynamics that in the last decade have changed Hamas through its governance rule, its bureaucracy, its own economy and fiscal leverage, and its military control of Gaza. It was a decisive change of the guard, perhaps the most important since the series of killings, extrajudicial killings, all killings are extrajudicial, in fact, that decimated Hamas cadres in the West Bank and Gaza. culminated with the killing of Ahmed Yassin, and nowadays we can add Ismail Haniyeh, Yahya Sinwar, Marwan Issa, and the missiles, the 12 missiles on the leadership, the collective leadership on Doha's headquarters, Hamas headquarters, and Salah al-Aruri, and so on and so forth. Since this change, the leadership abroad has taken on a more prominent role since the killings, based on the protection of the states that harbored the Politburo. Moreover, Hamas had been governing the Strip for 10 years, despite the blockade and wars on Gaza, causing the Gaza constituency to assume a specific weight that cannot be underestimated. Nor can it be overstated that just inside Gaza, there were two decisive actors in the equilibrium of the movement, the constituency and the military wing, itself more and more a shadow constituency, the fifth unrecognized shadowy constituency. There is also ample evidence of this to be found in what occurred just a few months earlier, in February 2017, when Hamas elected a hardline commander and founder of its armed wing as the movement overall leader in the Gaza Strip. Replacing Ismail Haniyeh, Yahya Sinwar election was therefore a sign of the growing power of Hamas' armed wing. However, it would be reductive and misleading to see Yahya Sinwar rise to power as a mere strengthening of the military wing's demands. The political stance adopted by Gaza's new leader reflected Sinwar's pragmatism and ability to navigate difficult waters. There was evidence of this, for example, in his relationship with Mohammed Allan, for example, a friend of their childhood, in his relation with Egypt and its security services, for decades at the center of all mediations between Palestinians and Israelis, Gaza and Israel, Hamas and Fatah. Yahya Sinwar's rapid ascent to the helm of Hamas in Gaza and the central Politburo between 10 years after his release from prison is much intelligible if we consider his long period inside the Israeli prison as a constitutive part of his political life. Born in 1962 in Khan Yunis, from a family of Palestinian refugees expulsed from Mashdal, one of the most important places for the Gazans, Sinwar had approached Palestinian political Islam and Sheikh Yassin in his early 20s. However, it did not belong to the Muslim Brotherhood, like, in fact, all those who founded Hamas later on. It did not, in short, have time to acquire a more critical role in the organization. In and out of prison several times, he was 26 years old when he was arrested in 1988 and convicted of 4 life sentences on charges of murdering Palestinian collaborators and masterminding the kidnapping of 2 Israeli soldiers. Therefore, Sinwar was not a central figure in a movement that had only been formally born a few months before, on December 1987, at a meeting at Sheikh Ahmed Yassin house in Gaza. He had founded instead, shortly before, an up-group al-Majid, the squad to identify and punish collaborators with Israel, alongside Rawi Mushtaha. He was killed also as Yahya Sinwar during the genocide. In Yahya Sinwar's path, that third of life inside a cell has taken on a political role, not an individual role. Prison is a continuation of militancy, though. In Yahya Sinwar's case, it specifically meant that climb up the Hamas hierarchy until he became the head of the Islamist movement's prison constituency, the most important in the Israeli prison system, since 1/3 of Palestinian prisoners belonged at that time, until October 7, to Hamas itself. In 2011, in the prisoners' exchange around the release of Gilad Shalit, Sinwar did not re-enter Gaza as a prisoner who had been away from his land and militancy for more than 2 decades. On the contrary, Sinwar re-entered Gaza on the strength of his role as head of the prison constituency, and the prisoner's file remained a priority even in his leadership of the Gaza constituency until October 7, 2023. Among the objectives indicated by Hamas, there was, in fact, the prisoner's file in the negotiation for another exchange between Israelis and Palestinians that had been going on since 2020 without reaching a settlement. It had indeed prompted Sinwar to raise the threatening tone in December 2022 during the celebration of the 35th anniversary of Hamas Foundation. But together with the prisoner's file and the West Bank dire conditions, Jerusalem was always among the objectives. Jerusalem is the unsurmountable red line for the national rather than religious identity of all Palestinians and their political leaders. It was so for Arafat, it was also so for Sinwar, who among his models, perhaps the most surprising at first sight, had Yasser Arafat himself, often cited in his speeches with the nom de guerre, Abu Ammar. It does not seem coincidental if one combines Arafat's name with the description of Sinwar as a nationalist, more nationalist than other Hamas leaders. Jerusalem is the symbol of Palestinian national unity for all intents and purposes. And the key turning point for transforming even Jerusalem into an instrument for surpassing the sealed borders of Gaza was undoubtedly the year 2021, which would tell more about the strengthening of the military wing. In March 2021, Sinwar won with no minor difficulties, the elections to lead again the Gaza Politburo for the second time. It took 3 ballots for Sinwar to obtain a majority of votes, confirming with this re-election the nomenclatura that has led Hamas since 2017 after Khalid Meshal stepped down. And it meant also a lot about the autocratic stance of Sinwar. Since then, it was Ismail Haniyeh who led the central Hamas Politburo. They were friends in Islamic University, by the way. And behind him, Sinwar led the most critical constituency, Gaza, where Hamas meant power and rule. For the first time, the 2 leading positions inside Hamas included figures from within, from Gaza, who had paradoxically overcome the Gaza embargo and brought the Islamist movement back onto the Palestinian political scene. In spring 2021, the general elections for the renewal of the PA parliament, scheduled to take place in May, were just a step away, hence 15 years after the Hamas victory, and shortly afterwards, the rift that still marks the Palestinian division. Hamas registered its list, the only one to contain Jerusalem in its very name. The Islamist movement wanted to profile itself as the guardian of Jerusalem, as well as Al-Aqsa Mosque, especially at the time when the influence of the right wing that represented the settlers, the Israeli settlers, was already well documented. And after that month, May was a very difficult month in Jerusalem, May 2021, the Sheikh Jarrah protest and the repression on the Haram al-Sharif, and the cutting of the Palestinian elections decided by Abu Mazen, Yahya Sinwar wasted no time. He profiled himself as the defender of Jerusalem. On May 10, from Gaza, sealed off from an entire world, he launched an ultimatum to the Netanyahu to withdraw its troops, police, and settlers for from the Aram al-Sharif, and after the deadline, Hamas fired a barrage of rockets into the Israeli territory, even at the periphery of Jerusalem, marking the start of an 11-day bloody operation called, not by chance, the Word of Jerusalem. And despite the high toll of Palestinian civilian casualties from the heavy Israeli shelling, Sinwar proclaimed that the resistance had won and that the 500 kilometers of tunnels have been hit to a minimal extent. They are the same tunnels we are speaking about since 2 years. It is, in fact, that Sinwar's presence was an overexpression of the link between the military and the political wing. And it's changed the reality on the ground. The role of the military instrument became central to the strategy of Sinwar, which was considered by the negotiators, Egyptian intelligence first and foremost, to be a flexible, pragmatic politician. He was capable, for instance, of reaching an understanding with a figure considered for many times the personification of Hamas adversary, Mohammed Alam. And since the beginning of his mandate as the head of Hamas in Gaza, Hamas had proposed a national army in Gaza, and we see the results of this idea through October 7, 2023. He proposed a national army in Gaza that encompassed Al-Qassam brigades and the other military groups, consisting of thousands of fighters. Our weapons must be under the umbrella of the Palestine Liberation Organization, he said, envisioning what he realized soon after. The confirmation had been coming from the very heart of what is called the Unified Resistance Command, which surfaced in the middle of 2023 with an interview given to Al Jazeera by Ayman Nofal, one of the highest ranking commanders of the Ezzedine Al-Qassam Brigade, who was killed in October by the Israeli armed forces. It was therefore one of the senior commanders who described the objectives and the very functioning of the unified command, in which each faction also had a political contact person. This means a lot for October 7, because we think about October 7 as the attack done by the Ezzedine Al-Qassam brigades and especially the Al-Nukba elite troops. But in fact, it was a unified command that put together different factions, armed factions, under only an umbrella. I stop here. I know that I was very long. It was very long as a presentation, but I think we don't go deep inside the role of Sinwar as an autocratic leader also. And we don't go, I think, deep inside the relation between the military wing and the political wing. And it is also because of this different relation between the two wings that we see and we saw in the last 2 years a lot of difficulties for Hamas abroad to negotiate the release of hostages, as it was impossible for Hamas abroad to negotiate without the voice of the Ezzedine Al-Qassam brigades from Gaza, because they were not only because they were there, they were the Al-Qassam brigades to have the Israeli hostages, but also because it was the role of the Qassam brigades to decide that whether yes or not a deal could be reached between Hamas and the mediators. That means Qatar, Egypt, and let's say United States, but I would say only Qatar and Egypt. And I thank you so much.